Another episode here of Getting There with Goss, where we talk about the career journeys of media members, coaches, business owners, athletes, and more from upstate New York. Joining us now, fantasy writer Mike Barner joins us. And if you're listening on an audio side, I'm just going to tell you now, pause this episode and go check out Mike's background. He has won the best background, I would say, of any episode of Getting There with Goss. It's got the perfect sports theme. He's got the jerseys up. He is looking good right now. So audio side, go give us some clicks on YouTube. But Mike, you could see me. I could see you. Let's get to the first question. A young Mike Barner, 6, 7, 8 years old. Where'd you grow up? What'd you want to be as a kid? Was it that same dream job when you're 18 years old?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I grew up in Ballston Spa. I live in Guilderland now, so I've been in the capital region basically my whole life. When I grew up, we didn't have cable as a kid, so I used to listen to all the Yankee games on the radio with John Sterling and Michael Kay, and I originally wanted to be the radio voice of the Yankees. I'm glad I gave that up because John Sterling is still going. So I'm glad I gave that up. I'm glad he's still going. I love John Sterling. But yeah, that's originally what I wanted to be, was the voice of the New York Yankees.
So when you hit 18 years old, like you mentioned, John Sterling is still there. So it's a little bit more of discouraging that, oh, that guy's still there. But when you're 18, what do you want to do? You're a sports fan. And at that 18 mark, is college the next path for you?
Yeah, I went to the University of Oswego for broadcasting and mass communications. I met my now wife when we were seniors in high school. And I knew that we were going to get married. And at that point, I kind of didn't want to do the broadcaster traveling schedule because I knew I wanted to get married and have kids. And those guys are on the road all the time. So I still went to school for broadcasting and mass communications. I knew I wanted to get involved with sports somehow. I've been playing fantasy sports for as long as I can, as long as I remember. I used to play on the old sporting news fantasy sites where you used to get your team was a set budget and their salaries would go up or down based on how well they performed. So you could go over your budget if your players were playing well. And it was just a cool format back then. And when I graduated college in December of 2006 is when I got my first fantasy sports writing job for KFFL. That's where I started.
Ooh, let's talk about that a little bit. So you're at Oswego, you're trying to find that path. You're in that interesting timeline of, I don't want to call it the explosion of fantasy, but it's close to on that rise. Take us through how you landed that first professional job as a fantasy writer.
Yeah, I got very lucky. And as we talk about the different steps in my career, you'll see I got very lucky several times with where I started in certain areas as certain things started to become more popular. When I started at KFFL Fantasy Sports, this was in January of 2007. I started at KFFL. Fantasy sports obviously weren't nearly as popular as they are now. When I started there, I was covering baseball and football. And what I used to do is I had what they called news shifts, and I would go on for 3-4 hours at a time, and I would just scan all different local newspapers throughout the country and try to find fantasy relevant news from any of those local newspapers, and then write something up quickly and put it on the site. So I worked for them for about a year. Then I tried my own website for a little while, like some GoDaddy thing. I tried that. And then I got my first big break. I started writing for RotoWire in March of 2010. I started covering baseball and basketball for them. And back then, when fantasy sports started, fantasy baseball was the most popular. Obviously now football is by far the most popular. Fantasy basketball was not very popular when I started at RotoWire in 2010. So I kind of got into that close to in the infancy. I love basketball. It's become the top sport that I cover. So I was lucky to get in back then. I got in on the ground floor. I did a lot of the same kind of thing where you look at for newspaper posts and how to make that stuff fantasy relevant. I used to do game wraps. I'd stay up till 1, 2 in the morning waiting for West Coast baseball games to end and write up summaries about players for fantasy purposes. So that was how I got started.
Let's go back to that RotoWire hiring process. Was it as simple as just an email that, hey, I write fantasy, I'm interested, and your process went along? How did the connection happen?
Yeah, I used to email places all the time. And if I recall this correctly, again, it's been a long time and my memory's kind of hazy. If I recall correctly, I had applied for a job with another site, and they had saw my background working for KFFL and that I went to school for this, and they actually forwarded me over to someone at RotoWire, and that's how I got started there. I didn't actually apply for RotoWire directly. I just had applied someplace that knew people at RotoWire, and they thought I'd be better suited for that because they were bigger. So I got pretty lucky there.
You also mentioned that when you were scanning those fantasy relevant information, was it just injuries at that point? Because when you're scanning that, I'll call it traditional media landscape, it might just be an injury update, or were there other things you were looking at when you talked about fantasy relevant news from around the country?
Yeah, well, a lot of it was injuries. Also, a lot of it was guys taking over jobs. This guy is now the closer, that kind of thing. When I started at KFFL, I'll never forget. I'm not that big into college sports. I cover Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NFL, so I can't cover everything completely in depth. So I've never been too big into college. And I remember when I worked at KFFL, one of the things they had me do was cover the combine. And I used to have to write posts about guys like verticals and their 40-yard dash times. And man, that was rough. I remember doing that in my bedroom at my parents' house, thinking, man, this is not exciting one bit. But everybody's got to cut their teeth somewhere.
Yeah, the underwear Olympics was not something that Mike found very fascinating or something that was fulfilling about watching guys run against air. Okay, I think many people do feel the same way that you do. So that early 2010 decade, you touched on how you enter into RotoWire. You're covering basketball. You might have a better feel for this than maybe I do, or something you may be listening right now. That when was this evolution of fantasy really take off? Was there a time, a moment, a season where fantasy went from diehard sports fan, diehard person about stats to this is now breaking into the mainstream and things like you and opportunities and responsibilities and how life starts to change for you?
Yeah, the biggest change for me and what enabled me to do this from a part-time to a full-time thing, first was the emergence of daily fantasy sports. That created a whole new arm of content for people like me, freelancers who were looking to do something, as opposed to your traditional fantasy content of, okay, well, this is a guy to pick up for waiver wire this week. These are free agents. This is a guy to drop, that kind of thing too. Okay, now there's big money on the line every night. You got to craft the lineup every night. Who are the guys to keep an eye on? Who's hurt? Who just took over more playing time? That kind of thing. And people didn't have the ability to be that in depth on a daily basis to where you've got a chance to win thousands of dollars every night in daily fantasy sports. So you got to be on top of it. So that's how I really got going closer from doing this part-time to full-time, is when daily fantasy sports started, and there was a lot more content out there available to write about.
I'm glad you brought that up. I had a nice graphic ready for you on our visual side too about that, because I wonder, when I hear guys like you who are writers who understand what you're going through, and there is that infancy of daily fantasy where, and maybe I'm assuming, I could be totally wrong here, but it seems like guys like you have an edge that you see stuff that other people don't. Was there ever a big boom for you where you started to play maybe DraftKings, FanDuel, or something else and thought, I personally, besides writing, can make a lot of money or a substantial living doing this? Did that ever happen for you where you became a player rather than a writer?
Yeah, no, I had a few nice hits. I never played big money. I was never one of those guys where you maxed out all the time on your contests. That was just never my. I really enjoy writing, so it never crossed my mind that I was going to get away from doing content and just playing that full time. I enjoy the content part of it more than anything else.
All right, that's a very humble answer. At some point, I'm sure I'll turn off the mic and be like, guys, I made $5 million. I just didn't want to tell anybody or my account. Okay, I'll assume that's the truth. Yeah. You mentioned fantasy football becoming more popular than fantasy baseball. What was it? Was it the expansion of television rights? Was it just fan? How did that happen from football to baseball, that transition of what was the most popular fantasy following?
I think fantasy football is easier. It's easier to follow. You've only got games essentially one day a week. I mean, now there's Thursday night football, and obviously there's always been Monday night football. But the most of your decisions are done. You've got waivers one day a week, and then you set your lineup one day a week, and that's easier for a lot of people to do. Fantasy baseball is an absolute grind, especially leagues where you have to set your lineups on a daily basis. I mean, you're working on this for 180, 190 days over the course of the season. It's a lot of work, and it's hard to get casual baseball fans to play fantasy baseball. It's not hard to get casual football fans to play fantasy football. It's an easy thing to do with your office mates and that kind of thing. Buddies that you went to school with, a way to stay connected after you guys graduate, that kind of thing. It's just fantasy football is a lot easier to manage on a weekly basis than baseball is.
So we see fantasy football emerging. We see daily fantasy emerging. And for you, for your personal career, you are a part-time person doing this. And you mentioned it became a full-time job. Is that just because of the, we'll call it, internet volume of people seeking you guys out? Was it given more opportunities? What made that happen for you? Or some people look at this and say, hey, that's my dream job. This guy gets paid to talk about fantasy sports. What was that shift for you from part-time to full-time, and how did it happen?
Yeah, it was another one of those things where I got lucky. I said I got into RotoWire when fantasy basketball wasn't that popular, and I was one of the few that was really into it. I was very into daily fantasy sports, and in 2017, I was doing content with RotoWire. They were basically the only site I was writing for. I had bounced around from other couple of sites too. I worked for Fansided for a little while. But then in 2017, I got signed up with a site called Lineup Lab. They were kind of like into lineup optimizing for DFS, and they were looking for content creators as well to help plug their software and provide daily content. So I had kind of combined their work. I ended up becoming their lead writer there. I did both season long and DFS, baseball, basketball, football. At one point, they had gotten rid of all the writers, and I was the only one doing it. So I had enough work that in November of 2017, I started doing this full time, and I quit my quote unquote day job.
Amazing, man. Just kept grinding at it and grinding and putting out that content. And that seems to be it, especially in this age when we're recording this in February 2022, that if you put it out, whether it be online or social media, it helps. I think that's been a part of it for you too, that I've seen it. You and I talked years ago. I've seen your personal growth on your social media platforms where you saw what happened, where you continue to put out content, how it went from an easy start to close to 5,000 followers on Twitter. And you got to watch that firsthand, that evolution.
Yeah, I would not be where I am without Twitter. I have found the vast majority of my work outside of RotoWire on Twitter. I got signed up with Sportsline. Who those aren't familiar, that's owned by CBS. That's their sports betting arm. I got signed up with them in 2018, and I found that just surfing Twitter. I would have searched daily for fantasy writing jobs, fantasy baseball jobs, fantasy basketball jobs, fantasy football jobs. Every day I would search on Twitter, and I would just mass apply to things. And that's how a lot of it came about to what I'm doing today. Now I write for 6 different companies as a freelancer. So.
Wild, man. Awesome stuff. Now, there has been a big change in the fantasy landscape in the world, not just because of the stats and the numbers and everything else, but here in New York, we're both New York guys. We've seen sports wagering now become legal. And these fantasy articles you were writing about, you mentioned daily fantasy, there was money involved, but there had to have been a boom here, whether it be in the last 18 months or hell in January 2022 when it turned mobile. What has the last few months been like for you, who you've gone from the ground floor all the way to where you are now, sports wagering? What's this been like for you and the push towards it?
Yeah, it's awesome. And this is kind of the last area where I got lucky. I got lucky. I was in season-long fantasy content when daily fantasy started. And I remember I applied for Sportsline to be a fantasy basketball writer. I signed up. I was going to do a weekly waiver wire column and a weekly schedule breakdown where I would talk about teams with favorable schedules and bad schedules each week and how that impacted fantasy sports. And a couple of days after I had gotten signed up with them and filled out all the paperwork, the guy that was the editor said, "Hey, by the way, we're looking for NBA handicappers. We don't really have a lot of guys right now. With your fantasy background, do you want to try it?" And I had never done, this was back in 2018. I'm not one of those illegal offshore book guys. I'm pretty cautious in that regards. I have 2 little kids and all that stuff, so I don't want to mess around with my luck, I'd get caught doing something. So I didn't want to mess around with it. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And that first year I had a lot of success. I ended up becoming one of their top NBA handicappers. And then it's just kind of snowballed from there. I started working for DraftKings. Also, I believe that was in 2018, doing daily fantasy sport content. So then I started doing sports wagering stuff for them too, as sports wagering became more popular. Now for Sportsline, I get to do a lot of cool stuff that's all focused around wagering. They have a show called The Early Edge, which is on daily at 10 o'clock in the morning. I know you're a wrestling guy. That's hosted by Jonathan, the Coachman.
Yeah.
So I get to work with him. I get to be on that show once or twice a week. And so, yeah, the sports betting thing created a whole new level of content for me to now, I write anywhere from 20 to 30 articles a week when you combine season-long daily fantasy and betting content. When sports seasons overlap, I'm pretty busy writing anywhere from 20 to 30 articles a week.
I know you don't want to give away the tricks of the trade because I want to make sure people follow you on social media and check out your articles and everything else. So if you want to make this generic, you can. I know some people, this is where the part of the interview where they're most excited to hear this. Any tips, anything you just seek out, like the most basic thing, if someone wants to wager just specifically on basketball or the NBA when it comes to fantasy, is there anything that jumps out to you? Said, okay, if we're starting this, best advice to do these wagers?
Yeah, I'll start out by saying this. A lot of people ask me, do you use projection models? Do you have your own model? I don't. I'm kind of a throwback guy. I've been doing this for a while. I watch a lot of games. I can't stay up till 1:30 in the morning anymore. Like I said, I have two little kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I physically can't stay up that late and then turn around and get up at 6 in the morning the next day. But I used to watch, I have League Pass. I used to watch all the West Coast basketball games all night long. So I have gotten a lot of my, betting background just on knowing the ins and outs and the last guy on the bench of every team because I have to for fantasy purposes. The best thing I can tell you for betting is to just be aware of injuries and what players are questionable with injuries and how roles are developing. You can get a lot of advantages. It's tough now with COVID because you never know. All of a sudden, the team has an outbreak and 5 guys are out. But one of the things I used to do a lot is you could go on and make bets in the morning just based on injury reports. I know this guy's probably going to rest because it's the second game of a back-to-back set, and he doesn't usually play both games of the back-to-back set, and the line hasn't adjusted to that yet because he hasn't been ruled out. It's like those kinds of things are important when you're looking at things to place a bet on.
You're helping people win some cash, by the way. I know you're being very humble right now, but the basketball side of it, maybe it's hard to have this type of, I want to say a comparison between your fellow writers that in comparison, I feel like you're doing just as good as anybody, right? A 2018 Writer of the Year. Your profits have been great. NBA stuff you're winning on, my friend. Like, not a lot of people who do this for a living can say consistently they're cashing in for the people who follow them.
Yeah, I've hit this year. I'm on 56% of my NBA against the spread hits on Sportsline. Picks have hit, so that's been pretty good. I think over the last couple seasons combined, I'm somewhere right around that same mark. I had an insane stretch a couple seasons ago where I was like 65% for 2.5 months. I got some really nice notes from people.
That's right. That's right. I remember that stretch. Yeah.
I'll never forget. I had one guy sent me a message, and he told me I single-handedly paid for his wedding, and I was like, "Oh, this is really awesome." But then, on the other hand, it's very much a "what have you done for me lately?" If I go on a stretch where I miss like 5 out of 7 picks, it's I can't believe you're one of the worst ever, and do they really pay you to do this? You can't figure anything. I mean, it's just how that kind of stuff works. And this is another piece of advice. If you're gambling on a daily basis, I mean, if you can hit anywhere from 53 to 56% of your picks, you're doing really well. It's almost like in baseball where, if you're successful 1 out of every 3 plate appearances, you're in the Hall of Fame. You're not going to go 70-75% on your bets for any prolonged period of time. So if you're not comfortable with losing stretches where you're going to go a week or two, or you're going to lose a lot of your bets, then betting is definitely not for you.
Now within 2022, paywall structures and subscriptions and ways in which people can bet. Have you watched more of your content go behind these types of paywalls for just because of the thirst of people wanting to find out how your picks and that happens?
Yeah, most of my stuff, well, actually, I would say about half of it is behind a paywall now. Sportsline is all behind a paywall. DraftKings is not. They're looking to push people to the DraftKings sports books, so that stuff is all out there. I started writing for a site called The Game Day. I believe I started there in early 2020. All that stuff is free. I do a lot of NBA player props there. I do that Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So that stuff is free. But yeah, a lot of stuff is going behind paywalls now, simply because there's such a desire for that kind of content that a lot of the sites and for people who complain, I have no control over which of my articles or picks go behind a paywall. They pay me, so I'm never going to complain if they make you pay for something that they pay me for. That's sometimes the best things that are not free. So always take that with a grain of salt. And I will always say, if you're looking for picks, do not go with anyone that is afraid to show you their record or that does not show their record up front. If anybody, oh, this is 100% guaranteed winner, put your mortgage on this one. Don't ever follow those kinds of people, because they can put you in a hole pretty quick.
I'm glad you exactly knew what I wanted out of that paywall question, because it is one of the most complained about things that happen across sports fans, that they just think everything should be free. And those people who want it for free will never thank you about the pick. They'll just assume it was theirs, but then they'll go after you when you get it wrong and complain that why'd you give me a way to lose my money for free? So yeah, I'm glad we clarified that. If someone's behind a paywall, it's because they also have to make a living too, and they need to find ways. Yes, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. And I will say, if you get into fantasy sports because you think you're going to make a lot of money, don't get into fantasy sports. Especially now, I'm very lucky. I have never worked for a company that didn't pay me at least something for what I was doing. Now, with how fantasy sports has become such a popular thing, the vast majority of the sites that hire people who haven't started before, they won't pay you, and you have to work a lot for free. I'm very lucky. I've never had to do that. But my wife has a really good job. We have benefits through her job. I have no health benefits through any of my jobs. I'm a freelancer. I have no retirement packages. I'm my own retirement package. So if you think that you're going to go into writing about fantasy sports and you're going to make a ton of money, you have to really enjoy this field, because there's not a lot of money in it.
Well, in comparison to fantasy, we talked about this boom earlier, that some might think about it might be more easy or more opportunities are out there to get these types of jobs because of the popularity. But like you just said there, everybody wants them. Everybody wants this opportunity. Yeah. So you've hinted at this already. If there is somebody, whether at your alma mater, Oswego, or somewhere maybe here in the capital region, that says, you know what, I want to do this. I want to be a fantasy football, basketball, baseball, fantasy sports in general, full-time writer and make this my job. 2022, maybe it's different than when you launched in 2007. What's the best advice you can give somebody hoping to have that job now?
Yeah, it's definitely very different now. The best thing you can do is to be active on social media. Back when I first started, there really wasn't a way to get your voice out there unless you started writing for one of these other sites that you could push your content through. Now there's tons of ways to get your voice out there or your work out there through social media. You can put videos on Twitter and YouTube and all that stuff. So the best thing I can tell you is be very active on social media. Look for jobs and opportunities to write on a daily basis. Apply for everything, even if you don't think you're qualified. And then when you do finally get something, make sure you network like crazy. I'm very lucky. Through RotoWire, I've been able to attend a lot of the different fantasy conventions, the fantasy sports. It's now the FSGA, because they've taken on gaming as part of the gambling explosion. I go to those conferences. They have a couple conferences a year. I've gotten work from meeting people at these conferences. I've developed some cool relationships from meeting people at these conferences. So the best thing you can do is to, they always tell you when you go to college, networking is very important. And you're like, oh, I'm going to get a job and I'll be fine. No, networking actually is very important. And it's important to get yourself out there and meet as many people as you can.
Well, Mike, thank you for sharing that advice. We appreciate it. For those who want to find you, who want to follow you on those social media platforms and everything else, and maybe for their first time, it's the first time they've been exposed to your work, tell us exactly where we can find you across all those platforms.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Roto Mike Barner. A lot of my work is on RotoWire, Sportsline, DraftKings, The Game Day. I'm currently writing for 6 different companies, so excuse the couple that escaped from my mind off the top of my head. I also work for Real Time Fantasy Sports. So yeah, whether you're into season-long fantasy sports, daily fantasy sports, you want to play some wagers, get some shekels out there, give me a follow on Twitter. I post links to all my work and all my picks, so you'll find it all there.
Don't worry, Mike. I'll be rolling in your direct messages very soon. Just ask you, what do you think about this game? What do you think about that game? So I will be annoying you like a freshman in college that's trying to get in the girls' DMs. Just plan on that for over the next few months here, with sports kind of being in a pause and the NBA really taking more limelight in college hoops and everything else. I know you're not a college guy, but I might just toss a lot of NBA picks at you. So be prepared for seeing some messages from me on Twitter. All right.
I'm ready. Send them my way.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the time, man. Keep up the great work.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.